I remember the exact sound that started it all. It was 21:37 on July 14th, 2024, and the fluorescent light above my desk in the command office at Fort Liberty buzzed softly as I wrapped up my shift. I had one last report to sign before heading out into the thick summer air. I'd done this 100 times before. Routine. Familiar. Safe. Then the fire drill alarm went off. That sharp, piercing tone echoed through the hallway, rattling the windows just slightly. Everyone around me had already evacuated as planned. I moved toward the door to do my final sweep, expecting to step out and follow procedure. I grabbed the handle. It didn't turn. A cold, metallic click followed the kind of sound that burns into your memory. I tried again harder this time, and the handle wouldn't budge. Then I saw her through the narrow glass panel. Vivian Blake. My stepmother. She was standing in the hallway wearing a crisp white blouse and holding her hands calmly in front of her like she had all the time in the world. Her lips curved into a smile that wasn't kind. It was cold and controlled the same smile I'd known since I was 15. She leaned slightly closer to the glass and said, her voice soft but cutting through the noise, "It's just a drill, Riley. Don't be dramatic." She tilted her head like she was scolding a child. I froze. The air suddenly felt heavier. A wave of heat rose from below the floor, and for a split second I thought I'd imagined it. But then the smell hit me. Acrid chemical burning. It slid under the door, faint at first, then thicker. It wasn't a drill. Someone had set something off on the lower floor. Smoke began seeping through the gaps around the door, curling upward like gray fingers reaching for the ceiling. I pounded my fist against the door and shouted for help. My voice bounced back to me, swallowed by the alarm and the growing roar in the distance. No one answered. I could still see Vivian. She didn't flinch. She didn't run. She simply turned her back, tucked a strand of hair behind her ear, and walked away down the hall with that deliberate calm she always used to make me feel small. I pressed my palm against the door. The metal was already warming beneath my skin. My heart slammed against my ribs, steady at first, then fast and chaotic. My throat burned as the first wisps of smoke filled the room. This wasn't panic, not the kind that makes you freeze. This was the kind that made you think in sharp, fast bursts. I ran to the phone, grabbed the receiver, and dialed 911 on base. I gave my rank, my name, my location. I shouted the words as clearly as I could over the blaring alarm. "Someone locked me in the command office." The dispatcher's voice cut through the chaos with practiced calm, telling me help was on the way, telling me to stay low, telling me to stay calm. My lungs were already tightening. The hallway lights outside flickered as the smoke thickened. I heard footsteps distantly. Then the sound of sirens rolled closer. A faint thud on the door made me step back. Someone was on the other side. I coughed hard, tasting the bitter smoke on my tongue. I shouted again, louder this time, and hit the door with both fists. The heat was rising fast now. Sweat ran down my neck and my eyes watered, not just from the smoke, but from the shock of it all. Vivian had locked me in. My stepmother, the woman who'd smiled through every family dinner and called me her daughter. She had locked me in. The sound of a crowbar hitting metal rang out. The door rattled then again, harder. I could hear shouting now clearer and a voice that belonged to one of the MPs I knew. The alarm's wail cut through everything sharp and steady. I crawled to the corner to stay low, pressing my sleeve over my mouth. The glass panel above the door blurred as the smoke thickened. Another slam. Another. Then light broke through as the door gave way with a loud metallic snap. A rush of clean air flooded in as two figures pulled me out. As the world tilted around me, the last thing I saw before everything blurred was the small brass lock hanging on the doorframe freshly installed. I knew exactly who had put it there. Vivian Blake, my stepmother. And this time, she wasn't going to get away with it. If you have ever trusted someone only to realize they held the key to your cage, keep listening. This story isn't just about fire. It's about what happens when the truth finally burns its way out. When people see Vivian Blake for the first time, they usually say the same thing. She seems so put together, elegant, polished, a woman who always knows which fork to use at dinner and how to make polite conversation sound like poetry. That's exactly what my father saw when he met her. I was 15, still learning how to braid my hair in the mirror of my room in our small house in Fayetteville. It was a quiet neighborhood, the kind where every lawn was trimmed the same and the mailman waved at everyone. I still remember the day she walked through our front door. She wore a pale blue dress, the kind that looked expensive but not flashy. She brought homemade bread wrapped in linen. My father, John Morgan, a retired Army sergeant with steady hands and a tired heart, looked at her like she was a miracle. I knew even then that miracles usually came with fine print. Vivian was perfect in public. She smiled at the neighbors. She knew every teacher's name. She hosted potlucks with matching tablecloths and hand-poured candles. But inside the house, she ran everything like a quiet, polished drill sergeant. Breakfast was at 0700. Shoes by the door, no crumbs on the counter, no raised voices unless they were hers. She had a way of speaking without yelling that could make a room colder in seconds. My father, who used to fill the house with stories from his service days, started speaking less. When I asked him why, he would just say Vivian likes things quiet. At first, I tried to follow the rules. It seemed easier than fighting. If she told me not to wear sneakers to dinner, I changed into flats. If she rearranged my room while I was at school, I forced a smile. But control isn't just about where you put your shoes. It seeps into how you breathe, how you speak, how you exist. Vivian liked everything to match, including the people around her. I didn't match. I liked my books messy, my shirts oversized, my music loud. She didn't say she hated it. She just looked at me like a stain on a white tablecloth. One night, I overheard her talking to my father in the kitchen. Her voice was soft, almost gentle. "She's a good kid," she said, "but she's unpolished. We can fix that." Fix. That word stuck in my head. I wasn't something broken, but from that night on, I understood that in her mind, I was a project, not a daughter, a problem to be solved. My father never defended me. He'd lost his fire years ago. He'd served 2 decades, and his body carried the weight of it. When Vivian spoke, he stayed silent like a soldier taking orders. When I turned 18, I enlisted. I told myself it was because I wanted to serve like my father, to make something of myself. But deep down, it was also because the Army was the only way out. Vivian smiled the day I left for basic training. Not the proud smile of a parent, the relieved smile of someone who'd finally cleared a space on a crowded shelf. She hugged me at the bus station, whispered in my ear, "Don't bring shame to the family, soldier," and pulled away before I could say anything back. In the years that followed, I kept my distance. Calls home were rare, short and cold. My father was aging, his health quietly declining, and Vivian was the gatekeeper of everything. When I called to check on him, she answered. When I asked to visit, she set the terms. She'd mastered the art of being polite and poisonous at the same time. "He's resting. Don't stir things up," she'd say. Or worse, "You're a soldier now. Focus on your duty. I'll take care of him." And I believed her because part of me wanted to. It was easier than fighting a war on 2 fronts. But time has a way of pulling you back where you don't want to go. A year ago, my father's health took a sharp turn. Heart issues, breathing problems. I applied for base housing near Fort Liberty so I could be closer at least for a while. I told myself it was temporary. I told myself I was strong enough to keep Vivian at a distance. I underestimated her. She moved closer too, into the same neighborhood, claiming she wanted to care for my father. In reality, it was about control. She loved being near the fortress of the Army without ever wearing a uniform. She liked the image. The respectable widow-to-be with a soldier stepdaughter. She didn't say it, but I could feel it every time she stepped into my space. She started small. Unannounced visits. Adjusting things in my house while pretending to help. "I just cleaned up a bit," she'd say when I came home to find my kitchen rearranged. She called me at random hours asking where I was, what I was doing. When I didn't answer right away, she left messages layered with sugar and barbs. "I just worry about you. Soldiers like you need a woman's touch to stay grounded." My father grew weaker as she grew bolder. She made decisions without asking me. She scheduled his appointments, controlled his medications, handled his accounts. She liked to remind me that while I wore the uniform, she ran the house. And she did it all with that same polished smile, the one that made other people think she was a blessing. One evening, after another tense dinner where she corrected the way I held my fork, I drove back to base with my hands gripping the steering wheel so hard they hurt. I didn't cry. I'd learned long ago that crying only fed her sense of power. I just stared at the dark highway, realizing that I'd escaped her once, and now I was being pulled back into her orbit like I'd never left. It was around that time that the little things started to change. A missing key here. A door closing too easily there. A look in her eyes that said more than her words ever did. I didn't know it yet, but she wasn't just satisfied with controlling my life anymore. She wanted to erase the part of it she couldn't control. She wanted me silent. If you've never lived with someone like Vivian Blake, it's hard to explain how they get under your skin. They don't shout. They build a world where every door is theirs to open or close. And when they smile, you forget for a moment that you've been locked inside it. But I'd learned to pay attention to the locks. I'd learned to keep track of which ones belonged to me and which didn't. That lesson started back when I was 15, standing in a quiet kitchen listening to a woman I didn't choose decide who I was going to be. It ended on the night she tried to lock me away for good. The signs started small, so small I almost convinced myself they were nothing. A loose detail here, a strange moment there, the kind of things you tell yourself not to overthink because overthinking makes you look paranoid. But the truth is, danger never arrives all at once. It creeps in. It settles in the corners of the room until you can't ignore it anymore. It was early summer at Fort Liberty, the air thick and humid, the kind that clings to your skin even at night. I'd been working the evening rotation for weeks, logging hours in the command office, signing off reports, locking up behind everyone else. Routine. I knew how that office smelled after hours. I knew the way the fluorescent lights hummed just a little louder when the building emptied. I noticed it first with the spare key. Every shift I did a key check, and I knew the exact scratch on the edge of the spare for the command office. One night, I opened the lockbox and saw a different one. Shiny, new, no scratches. I asked around and no one had filed a change. The duty roster didn't mention it. Supply didn't either. The sergeant on duty just shrugged. Probably someone misplaced the old one, he said. It happens. But things like that don't just happen here. Not in a controlled environment like Fort Liberty. A few nights later, the filing cabinet looked wrong. I know how that sounds, but when you've spent enough hours in the same office, you learn what order everything sits in. Duty logs are always on the left, range schedules on the right, personnel sign-ins stacked in the center. That night, everything was reversed, not sloppy, deliberate. Someone had taken their time to go through them and put them back differently, like they were testing how closely I paid attention. No one else seemed to notice. When I asked my shift partner if he'd moved anything, he laughed it off. Probably the cleaning crew, but the cleaning crew doesn't have access to that cabinet. Only duty staff and officers do. Then there was the storage incident. It was a Friday afternoon, mid-June. We were running a supply drill and I was assigned to check inventory in the back storage room. When the drill ended, I waited for someone to unlock the door. No one came. I banged. I shouted. I radioed. No response. For almost 30 minutes, I was stuck inside a room with nothing but old radios, filing boxes, and the faint smell of dust. When someone finally came, they looked confused, like they hadn't even realized I was missing. "Guess we forgot about you, Morgan," one of the guys joked. Everyone laughed. I forced a laugh too. But that night, lying in my bunk, I replayed it over and over. How does someone just get forgotten in a secured facility during a drill? The jokes kept coming. My team teased me about being cursed, doors closing on me, locks changing, logs rearranged. I wanted to believe them. I wanted to laugh. But a knot had started forming in the pit of my stomach, slow and tight. I grew up around control. I knew what it felt like when someone was building a cage one bar at a time. Back home, things weren't any better. My father's health was deteriorating quickly. I spent most evenings after shift driving to his house, sitting by his bedside watching him sleep while Vivian hovered like a shadow. She talked softly, smiled politely, and made me feel like a stranger in my own family. But there were whispers too. Neighbors mentioning she'd been spending time with certain men in town. A retired contractor with a badge to access parts of the civilian complex near the base. A man who worked in security for one of the logistics companies that did business with Fort Liberty. They called it networking. I called it what it was, maneuvering. Vivian had always known how to charm people with small power. She'd spent years perfecting it. Around that time, she started showing up at the base gates more often. She'd drop off meals for my father at the clinic and somehow end up chatting with the guard on shift. She'd wave at me as I passed through like she belonged there. She didn't, but the way she moved made it feel like she did. Vivian wasn't the kind of woman who did anything without a plan. I brought up the strange incidents with my platoon sergeant one afternoon. I didn't give details. I just said things felt off. He nodded politely but didn't press. Without proof, it just sounded like a soldier tired from long shifts. And I was tired. I was running back and forth between a crumbling home life and a place that was supposed to be predictable. The Army isn't soft. It doesn't deal in maybes. Either you have evidence or you don't. Still, I started paying closer attention. I began memorizing the exact position of everything before leaving the office each night. I noted the subtle smell of burnt dust near the control panel, something that hadn't been there before. Once I arrived to find the door already unlocked, though I was scheduled to be the first on shift. No one had logged in early. No one admitted to opening it. I didn't know who to trust. The people around me weren't malicious. They just didn't see it. And people who don't see danger often make you feel crazy for sensing it. That was the hardest part. Vivian had made me doubt my instincts for years. Now those instincts were ringing like alarms in my head, and I didn't have a single piece of hard evidence to prove they were right. The turning point came 2 weeks before the fire. I stayed late one evening finishing a training report. The office was quiet, the kind of silence that makes you hear your own breath. I reached for my coffee cup and froze. The spare key was gone again, not replaced. Gone. Someone had removed it without logging the action. I checked the roster. No notes. I checked the security feed access list. No flags. Whoever had taken it knew exactly how to do it without leaving footprints. That night when I drove home, Vivian was sitting on the porch. She wore that same calm smile she always used when she was 2 steps ahead of everyone else. "You work too much," she said. "People who work too much stop seeing what's right in front of them." She sipped her tea, not looking at me. She didn't have to. I knew she was talking about me, about my father, about the fact that this was her house, her rules. I didn't say anything back. I just walked past her into the house. But something shifted in me that night. I'd spent years underestimating how far she would go. Now I knew better. These weren't accidents. These weren't jokes. Someone was testing the edges of my routine, pushing on the weak points. And every instinct in me told me Vivian's fingerprints were somewhere in the background, even if I couldn't see them yet. I was trained to trust evidence, but some things you feel in your bones long before the proof catches up. I'd spent a lifetime being gaslighted by this woman. I wasn't going to let her make me doubt myself again. I will never forget the way she smiled that night. It was late, the kind of humid summer night in Fayetteville where the air hangs heavy like a curtain and even the crickets sound tired. I parked in front of the house, headlights cutting through the stillness, and there she was. Vivian Blake, sitting on the porch like she owned the world. She had a glass of iced tea in her hand, the condensation running down the sides, her posture straight, shoulders back like a woman completely certain of her control. She didn't even bother pretending anymore. When I walked up the steps, she tilted her head and said, "Don't think the Army will protect you from family." The way she said it wasn't loud. It was soft, deliberate, like a thread tightening around my throat. I stopped halfway up the steps. My heart didn't pound this time. It went still, like the silence before a storm. "What did you just say?" My voice was steady, colder than I expected. She swirled the ice in her glass and took her time answering. "You heard me, Riley. You may wear that uniform, but at the end of the day, you're still mine to manage." I laughed, not because anything was funny, but because the audacity of it landed like a slap. "Manage, you don't manage me. You never did." She leaned forward, her voice dropping low. "Oh, sweetheart, you think rank means anything here. You think those soldiers will stand between me and what's mine. I made your father choose me." The words hit like a gut punch. I had always suspected it, but hearing her say it out loud with that cool certainty stripped something raw inside me. "You manipulated him," I said, my voice sharpening. You isolated him. You isolated me." She didn't deny it. She smiled. "I saved him. I built this house. I built this family. And you were just a complication. A stubborn, ungrateful child who thought the world owed her something." Her tone didn't rise, but every syllable was precise, meant to cut deep. I stepped close enough to smell the faint trace of the expensive perfume she wore when she wanted to make a point. "I'm not a child anymore," I said. "And you don't get to talk to me like I belong to you." She looked at me with that same cold calculation she used on my father. "Oh, but you do. You've always belonged to me. I made the rules. I still make the rules. The only difference is you've gotten better at pretending you don't care." The air between us shifted then. This wasn't the subtle fencing we'd always done. This was a battle line drawn in full. My father was asleep upstairs, too weak to intervene. The house was quiet except for the ceiling fan whirring overhead. "You're sick," I said, and she laughed softly. "No, Riley. I'm just smarter than you. You wear a uniform and follow orders. I give them. That's the difference between us." Her words were sharp, but they didn't land the way they used to. I'd spent years believing I was trapped in her game. Now I could see the game board clearly. Her power wasn't some immovable force. It was built on silence, on people like my father who let her speak without pushing back on me, staying quiet to keep the peace. I took a step forward until we were eye to eye. "This is the last time you'll talk to me like this." She raised an eyebrow, amused. "And what will you do? Soldier, file a complaint. Call your little army friends to protect you from Mommy." She said the word like poison. "You're just a soldier. I make the rules." She didn't realize that this was the moment everything changed. Not because she suddenly became more dangerous, but because I finally stopped being afraid. I didn't scream. I didn't cry. I just stared at her and said, "Then I guess it's time to change the rules." She looked taken aback for half a second, just enough to let me see the crack in her armor. Then she recovered with that infuriating calm. "We'll see, Riley. We'll see." She stood up, brushed invisible dust from her dress, and walked inside, leaving the door open behind her like she'd already won. But this time, I didn't follow her in. I sat down on the porch steps, the night air heavy against my skin, and let everything she said settle in. She'd admitted what I'd always known in pieces. She'd manipulated my father. She saw me as property. She believed she could control everything around her. The difference was now, I wasn't 15. I wasn't the girl trying to make her smile or avoid her cold disapproval. I was a staff sergeant in the United States Army. I knew how to hold a line, and I knew how to gather proof. I thought about the spare key, about the storage room, about the way the locks had changed and the files had been moved. I thought about the people she had charmed around the base. Vivian wasn't just dangerous because she was cruel. She was dangerous because she was clever. And clever people leave footprints when they think no one's watching. I stood up and walked inside past the living room where her perfect family photos lined the wall. Every picture told a lie. Every frame was a performance. She had always controlled the narrative. But not anymore. I climbed the stairs quietly, the house groaning under my steps, and stood by my father's door. He was asleep, his breathing shallow, the machines softly beeping beside his bed. I wanted to shake him awake, tell him everything she'd said, but I didn't, because he wouldn't fight her. Not anymore. That fight belonged to me now. I closed my eyes and made a quiet promise. If this escalated, if the strange signs became something worse, I wouldn't let her bury me in silence like she had all those years. I would gather every word, every threat, every piece of proof. I would make sure if she ever crossed that line, there would be nowhere for her to hide. When I left the house the next morning, the sun was just beginning to rise over the base. I could still hear her voice in my head. "Don't think the Army will protect you from family." But what she didn't understand was that I didn't need protection anymore. I needed a plan. And for the first time in years, I had one. I started small because that is what survival looks like when you have to play a careful game. I could not afford dramatic moves that would alert her or give her reason to tighten the noose. The first thing I did was back up everything on my phone. It sounds trivial until you realize how many times a person erases themselves by letting others control the narrative. I copied messages, calls, photographs, and notes onto a secure cloud account I opened under an alias. Then I saved copies onto a tiny encrypted drive I hid inside a paperback novel on my shelf. The drive was the size of a postage stamp, and I slid it into the hollowed center of a book the way soldiers hide small things in plain sight. I labeled the notebook with a meaningless title and placed it between war histories so it would look like part of the decor. The act of saving those files felt like reclaiming pages of my life that someone else had been trying to edit out. I started keeping timestamps of odd things too. If a key was moved, I wrote the date and the shift. If a file was rearranged, I noted the time and who had been in the office that day. The list grew into a record, and a record can be used later to prove a pattern. Next, I made the office safer in ways that would not break rules. I knew the boundaries because I had worked logistics long enough to understand what was permitted in a personal workspace. I purchased a small commercially available camera designed for desk use, the kind you see on streamers and in home offices. It was not hidden in a way that would violate base policy. I positioned it on my desk so it faced the door but did not invade the privacy of others who used the office during shifts. The camera recorded everything that happened in front of the desk and uploaded footage automatically to my encrypted cloud at the end of each day. I tested it the first night by pretending to step out and return. The little light blinked like a heartbeat. I felt ridiculous and relieved at once. It was a small measure of control, but in a house built from other people's definitions of order, small measures are what you cling to. Passwords came next. I changed the passwords on my work accounts, the ones that were mine, the ones that could be reset by someone with casual access if I left them known. I picked sequences that didn't relate to my name or my family, but to lines of poetry I loved. It made me smile in a way that felt illicit. I put new locks on my personal storage box and kept the keys on a chain beneath my uniform when I slept. I also bought a location tracker the size of a coin and hid it inside the lining of my uniform jacket's pocket. It pinged my phone when the jacket left a radius I set. I did not tell anyone about the tracker. It was not about mistrust of my unit. It was about knowing if someone else handled my things without my permission. That detail would become vital later. I reached out to an MP I had known since my first assignment. He was an older guy, the kind who had been through too many seasons and had seen the quiet patterns people fall into when they think they can get away with control. I did not expect an official investigation based on my worry alone, so I framed our conversations carefully. I said things like, "I am noticing odd access to my workspace," and he would nod and say, "Keep an eye on it and report any hard evidence." He told me to log everything. He gave me a notepad with official stamps on it, telling me it could be used to show I had been diligent about reporting. He did not promise to act immediately, but his attention felt like a small shield. Having one person outside the house aware of my unease made me feel less alone. It also meant that if something went wrong, there might be a connecting thread someone could follow. The most difficult part was baiting my own instincts without provoking a confrontation. I listened to her words and recorded them. Not in a hidden, illegal way, but by taking careful notes after conversations and by saving voice messages she left on my phone after visits. One night, she had left a message that I transcribed later, word for word. She had said, almost laughing, "When the fire drill comes, we will see how tough you are." I read it and reread it until the phrase lodged in my bones. It sounded like an offhand comment, something a woman might say to toy with a teenager, but the tone was different. It was precise. It was a test. I could feel the undertone that meant someone was checking a line. I printed the transcript and put it in the encrypted folder with a note about when and where it was recorded. There were practical things I did to make sure I could communicate even if my phone went dead. I purchased a small prepaid flip phone with cash and hid it inside the insole of an old boot I kept for drills. The battery life on that cheap device could last days, and it would be useless to anyone who did not know where to look. The idea of using a shoe as a safe felt almost comically low-tech, but that is often the best strategy when your opponent expects sophistication. I also bought a tiny whistle and clipped it to the pocket of my uniform for times when my voice might be taken away. It was a soldier's whistle in a civilian's idea, and I practiced the sound silently, pumping it in the palm of my hand so I could make a small noise if I needed to attract attention without announcing panic. I also ran simulations in my mind, like a commander runs exercises. If a drill was announced, who would be the last to leave? Which doors might be left unlocked? Where were the vulnerabilities in the building's ventilation that would allow smoke to creep into closed rooms? I mapped escape routes on a mental blueprint, and then I wrote them down in a pocket notebook I kept in the gloves compartment of my car. I memorized the cadence of the alarms so that if one sounded, I would be able to tell whether it was the scheduled drill or something else. Oddly, that was a comfort. Training had taught me to observe patterns and break them into manageable pieces. It turns out you can use training to protect yourself from someone who weaponizes routine. I tightened my social circle, but not in obvious ways. I became friendly at work in a way that made people comfortable confiding minor details around me. Not because I was gossipy, but because I wanted to know who came and went in the hours I did not, who had keys, who had been chatting near the supply room. Information is as useful as evidence when you know how to read it. I left small things in places where someone might notice, like a deliberately misplaced pen on the desk, then noted whether it moved by the end of a shift. It sounds petty, but each small displacement was data. Despite all this, there were moments when I doubted myself. The Army teaches you to trust orders and to trust your chain of command, but there is a loneliness in being a soldier who is also someone's stepdaughter. I tried to present my concerns formally where it mattered, and I did. I filled out reports when it felt appropriate. I asked supply to log changes. I told my MP contact the dates and times when keys went missing. But paperwork is a slow machine, and it needs concrete evidence to act decisively. The logs accumulated, but action did not come fast enough for my instincts. Vivian was patient in ways that were almost surgical. She waited to strike when a window of opportunity appeared. One night, I tested the camera by leaving a printed note on the desk that said, "If you move this pin, I will know why." I left early on purpose. When I checked the footage later, I watched a woman in a pale blouse enter the office, move the pin, and stand looking out the window. Her hand lingered near the lockbox. The footage quality was grainy, but her face was unmistakable in the angle that caught the light. I slowed the playback and watched her fingers close around a key. I felt something fall out of my usual composure, but I did not react outwardly. Instead, I saved the file to 3 different locations and labeled them with the date and time. The next day, I brought the footage to my MP contact and asked him to look. He watched it without comment and then said, "We will need a chain of custody for this." He offered to help me document it properly. Even then, I did not fully understand how dark the threat was, only that it existed and that the person behind it was methodical. The note she had left about the drill had been an insult, but the act of mocking my fear was worse. It is one thing to be cruel. It is another to be clever enough to hide cruelty behind civility. The idea of a drill became a weapon the moment someone decided to use procedure as camouflage. I slept less and checked my hidden backups more. I rehearsed small phrases I would say to MPs if I had to be rescued so that the words would be clear and could be used later. I practiced mentioning specific items the way a witness does, so when I recounted events, my testimony would be precise. In the quiet moments between shifts, I taught myself the patient work of evidence gathering, because there is a kind of courage that is quiet and accumulative, and that is the courage I needed. What I did not yet know was how quickly the test would escalate and how wide the net Vivian had been casting. I had created a small safety net of records and people who would listen. I had hidden a phone in a boot and memorized escape routes. I had footage that placed her hands near my office key. I had a note transcribed and saved. I had an MP who agreed to help document a chain of custody. All of that would matter. None of it would feel like enough on the morning the alarm sounded and the lock clicked shut behind me, but together, those small measures would be the threads that kept me from unraveling completely. July 14th, 2024 started like every other scheduled drill day, except this time I woke up with the sharp taste of metal in my mouth, the kind you get before a storm hits. Fort Liberty was already awake when I arrived for the evening shift. The fire drill schedule had been posted for weeks, a routine event everyone on base barely noticed anymore. I knew the timing the evacuation pattern the way the command office would empty out like clockwork, and so did she. The humid air wrapped around me like wet cloth as I walked into the building at 18:30, nodding at Specialist Carter on his way out. My shift was set to end after the drill. I was assigned to secure the office as the last person out, a role I had done 100 times without incident. Everything smelled normal then: paper, dust, the faint scent of burned coffee left on the warmer. I logged into the system, checked the roster, watched people file out as the first alarms blared at 19:05 sharp. The sound was shrill but familiar. Over the PA, someone's voice came through calm and rehearsed. "This is a scheduled fire drill. Proceed with evacuation." The floor creaked with hurried boots. People laughed as they left. Nobody takes drills too seriously when they've done them over and over again. I stayed behind as planned, checking every room like muscle memory. My steps echoed through the quiet hallway once the noise of the crowd faded. That's the moment I first felt it, a stillness that didn't belong. I went back into the command office to grab the logbook, the last step before locking up. I turned toward the door to leave, but the heavy metal door swung shut faster than I expected. It clicked. Not the usual latch click. It was the sound of a key twisting in a new lock. A clean, hard snap. My breath caught in my chest. I lunged for the handle, twisted. It didn't budge. The drill was happening outside. The hall was empty. I pushed harder. Nothing. And then, through the small square window in the door, I saw her. Vivian Blake. She wasn't supposed to be anywhere near this building, let alone inside during a drill. She was supposed to be at home. But there she was in a light summer coat, her hair tied neatly, looking like she'd just stepped out of a magazine. She stood at the end of the hallway, her hands resting on the railing. She saw me. Our eyes met through the glass, and she smiled. That smile I'd learned to fear as a child. Controlled, measured, cold. "It's just a drill," she mouthed, lifting her chin slightly. Then she turned and walked away as the last light above the exit flickered. I slammed my fist against the door. "Vivian!" My voice echoed down the hallway, but the sound died before reaching anyone. She didn't even look back. She disappeared around the corner, her steps steady like she wasn't leaving someone trapped in a room that could turn into a coffin. I grabbed the handle again and pulled until my arm ached. My pulse pounded in my ears. I knew in that instant that this wasn't just another drill. Something else was happening. The first hint of smoke arrived not long after. It crept in through the bottom seam of the door in a lazy gray ribbon. I knelt down and pressed my hand against the floor. Warm. Too warm for a standard simulation. Somewhere below, someone had started a real fire. I could taste it in the air. Not the crisp, sterile scent of burned wood chips from training exercises, but the sharp, acrid sting of burning plastic and wiring. Someone had set this up to feel real because it was real. I pulled my radio, pressed transmit. "Command office to security. This is Morgan. I'm locked inside the office. The door won't open." "Do you copy?" Only static answered. Either the signal was blocked or no one was close enough to hear. My throat tightened as the smoke thickened. I forced myself to breathe slow and low. Panic doesn't help anyone survive a fire. I turned toward the small glass window again and banged until my knuckles stung. Still nothing. I pulled out my phone, dialed 911 on base. "Fort Liberty Emergency Dispatch," a voice answered. "This is Staff Sergeant Riley Morgan. I'm locked inside the command office during the scheduled drill. Smoke is entering the room." "This is not a simulation." The dispatcher's voice sharpened. "Stay calm, Sergeant. We are alerting military fire and MPs now. What's your location?" I gave them every detail: hallway, wing floor, door number. As the minutes crawled, the smoke started to settle in thick waves. The red emergency lights blinked in a slow, cruel rhythm, washing the room in a pulsing glow. The silence outside was unbearable. I crouched down near the lowest point of the room, pressing the sleeve of my uniform over my mouth, counting my breaths. Every sound became amplified: the hum of the vent, the faint crackle of something burning below my heartbeat like a drum in my skull. I crawled to the desk and ripped open the bottom drawer where I kept the emergency flashlight. My hand shook slightly as I clicked it on. The beam caught on the thin layer of smoke rolling like fog along the ceiling. I could hear footsteps in the distance, then heavy boots pounding against the hallway floor. Someone shouted orders. A crowbar slammed into the door. Relief burned through the terror. "Stand back," a voice yelled. I pressed my back against the opposite wall as the sound of metal meeting metal filled the room. The door handle shook. One more blow, then another. The lock cracked. The door burst open, flooding the room with cooler air from the hallway. Two MPs rushed in with flashlights raised, followed by firefighters in full gear. "She's in here!" one of them shouted. Hands grabbed me steady and firm, pulling me to my feet. I stumbled out, coughing hard enough to see stars. The corridor outside was chaotic. Alarms still blared. Firefighters stormed toward the stairwell leading to the lower floor. Thick gray smoke was already climbing upward. "Who locked that door?" an MP barked. I couldn't answer at first. My throat burned. I just raised my hand weakly and pointed toward the hallway where Vivian had disappeared minutes earlier. "Vivian Blake," I rasped. "She was here. She locked me in." He frowned. "Civilian." "My stepmother," I whispered. As they hustled me down the hall toward medical, I caught sight of something on the security monitor near the entrance. A feed from the hallway camera time-stamped minutes earlier showed a woman with light hair and a pale coat walking away from the command office. She paused for a second, then disappeared out the exit. There was no mistaking her face. Vivian Blake had been recorded. I didn't remember much of what happened in the next 10 minutes, just fragments. The firefighters shouting fire source downstairs, the sound of water rushing through hoses, the cold oxygen mask pressed over my mouth as medics checked my vitals, the flash of blue emergency lights from outside. I heard one of the MPs mutter something about the lock. "This isn't standard issue. This lock was changed recently." Another voice responded, "We'll need CID on this." The base emergency response moved with trained precision. The lower floor fire was contained quickly, but not before scorching a supply area near the stairwell. The investigation started right there in the hallway, still echoing with alarms. Someone collected the lock cylinder. Another marked off the hallway for evidence. I sat wrapped in a blanket, my hair damp with sweat, and stared at the feed still looping on the security monitor. Vivian's image walked away over and over again, her posture calm, her steps slow. The thought that had haunted me for weeks settled like a stone in my chest. She hadn't been testing me. She'd been preparing for this. That message she'd left, "When the fire drill comes, we'll see how tough you are," had never been idle cruelty. It had been a blueprint. She'd known the schedule. She'd known my role. She'd known exactly how much time she needed to turn a routine drill into a trap. An MP crouched down in front of me, his notepad out. "Sergeant Morgan, we need to ask you a few questions. You said Vivian Blake was on the premises." I nodded. "Did anyone else have access to that lock?" "No," I croaked. "It was changed without notice weeks ago." "She's the only person I saw." They took my statement twice. The first time was a blur. The second was slower, calmer as the medics cleared me to leave. They logged the timeline down to the minute 19:05 drill began. 19:08 door locked. 19:13 smoke detected. 19:19 emergency services arrived. 19:24 door breached. When I finally stepped outside, the night air hit me like ice. The building loomed behind me, lights flashing, smoke drifting upward like a dark ribbon. A part of me wanted to scream. Another part just stood there, hands clenched at my sides, staring at the entrance where she had walked out. I'd spent years letting her chip away at me. That ended tonight. The MPs escorted me to a holding area where CID investigators had already set up temporary operations. A plainclothes agent nodded as I entered. They'd already pulled the hallway footage. Vivian Blake was officially under investigation for suspected arson and unlawful confinement. For the first time in a long time, the balance shifted. She'd stepped out of the shadows she'd always operated in. And this time, I wasn't the only one who saw it. The CID building on Fort Liberty looks ordinary from the outside, just a squat concrete structure with frosted windows and a flag out front, but inside it feels like stepping into a different world. It's quiet in a way that eats sound. Even the click of boots on the tile floors seems to fade too fast. When they called me in 3 days after the fire, I already knew this wasn't going to be a casual conversation. The moment the MPs pulled that new lock from the command office door, the moment they saw the footage of Vivian walking away, it stopped being a drill incident. This was criminal. The CID team didn't waste time. I sat in a plain chair at the end of a long table. Across from me was Special Agent Thomas, a man who spoke like he measured every word before releasing it. To his left was a younger agent typing quietly. Staff Sergeant Morgan Thomas began his tone calm but not soft. What happened on July 14th wasn't just an accident. You know that, we know that, and now it's time to put it on record properly. I nodded my palms flat against the table. I had run this moment through my mind every night since the fire, but the reality of sitting in an official interview felt heavier than expected. They played the footage first. The camera feed from the hallway outside the command office flickered to life on the mounted screen. There she was, Vivian. Her hair tied neatly back, her hand casually resting on the railing. The timestamp read 1907. She looked toward the door. I watched my own blurred silhouette behind the glass, pulling at the handle, like someone trapped in a sinking ship. Then she lifted the key, turned it, and walked away. There was no hesitation, no confusion. Just that steady walk I'd known my whole life, the one that said she thought she was untouchable. Thomas paused the footage at the exact moment her profile filled the frame. "You're sure this is Vivian Blake?" "Yes," I said without hesitation. My voice didn't shake. "That's her." Then they slid the evidence file across the table. A clear plastic bag held the lock cylinder they'd removed from the command office door. Next to it, printed forensic reports. "New lock," Thomas said. "Installed recently. Not registered in the base inventory. And most importantly," he flipped to a page and slid it toward me. "Fingerprints. Hers. Right on the mechanism." The younger agent spoke for the first time. She had no authorized reason to be inside the building during the drill. No civilian clearance. No visitor pass issued that day. Nothing. I let out a breath I didn't realize I was holding. Weeks of second-guessing myself, of collecting quiet little pieces of proof, were finally laid out in front of someone who saw it too. It wasn't in my head. It never had been. Then Thomas reached for another folder. "We also received an audio file," he said. "A voice message you forwarded from your phone." My throat tightened. I knew which one. The one where Vivian's voice, smooth and smug, whispered, "When the fire drill comes, we'll see how tough you are." The audio played through the small speaker in the room. Her voice filled the space like smoke filling a room, soft but poisonous. Thomas looked up at me. "You said she sent this a week before the incident." "Yes," I said. "She didn't even try to hide it. She thought I wouldn't do anything." He tapped the folder once. "We also recovered residue near the stairwell below the command office. Traces of an accelerant. Someone set a real fire that night. Not a spark, not a malfunction. An intentional ignition." For a long moment, no one spoke. The room was too cold, the kind of cold that seeps into your bones. Vivian had always played mind games, but hearing it laid out like a criminal case made everything real in a way I hadn't expected. This wasn't just family cruelty anymore. This was attempted murder on federal property. Then came the confrontation. They didn't make me sit in the same room with her. CID doesn't do theatrics. But they did let me observe from behind the mirrored wall as they brought her in. She wore a beige jacket like she was attending a garden brunch, not a criminal investigation. Her hands were folded delicately on the table. She smiled faintly at the agents like she still thought she was in control. Agent Thomas didn't waste time. He hit play on the same footage they'd shown me. Vivian's smile faltered slightly as her image filled the screen. She leaned forward, just a little, as if trying to find a version of this story where she could explain it away. "This isn't what it looks like," she said finally, her voice smooth. "It was just a drill. I didn't think she'd be in there. It was just a drill." Those words echoed like poison through the observation room. Thomas pressed a button. The audio file played. Her own voice filled the room again. "When the fire drill comes, we'll see how tough you are." She closed her eyes briefly, and that tiny crack in her performance felt like the first real victory I'd had against her in years. Thomas leaned forward. "So, Ms. Blake, help me understand. If this was just a drill, why was there an unauthorized lock on the command office door with your fingerprints on it?" She didn't answer. "And why?" He continued, voice hardening. "Does this recording exist of you threatening the victim a week before the incident?" Still nothing. She tried to pivot. Vivian always pivots when cornered. She told them she was just visiting. She told them she wanted to surprise me. She said she didn't set any fire. But none of it mattered because they had the lock. They had the footage. They had the recording. They had the fingerprints. And when Thomas played the 911 audio of my voice coughing and gasping behind a locked door, the air in the room shifted completely. Her composure cracked. The sound of me choking on smoke was undeniable. "You left her in there," Thomas said quietly. "A soldier. Your stepdaughter. You locked the door and walked away." She tried to look composed, but her fingers twitched against the table. When they escorted her out of the room, the faint smile she used to wear like armor was gone. For the first time in my life, she wasn't the one holding power. The investigation moved fast after that. CID doesn't play with arson on base property, especially not when it intersects with attempted murder. They compiled everything into a formal report. Lock, footage, audio, fingerprints, 911 call, timeline. They reconstructed the sequence minute by minute. They even mapped the accelerant trail downstairs, concluding that someone had deliberately set a small but controlled fire to make sure the drill would escalate beyond simulation. I sat in the conference room as Thomas briefed me on the next steps. "We're sending everything to JAG," he said. "Given the severity, it'll involve both federal charges and military jurisdiction for the on-base incident. This isn't just a family issue anymore. This is a felony case." Hearing those words out loud felt like the ground finally steadied beneath my feet. For years, Vivian had operated in that gray zone where cruelty doesn't quite fit into a legal box. She'd whispered threats no one could prove, closed doors no one else saw, twisted my world until I doubted my own instincts. But here in this building, her cruelty had fingerprints. Her lies had timestamps. Her mask had been recorded. I left the CID building that day with a copy of my official statement in my hand. The summer air outside felt different, less heavy. Soldiers walked past me toward the mess hall, laughing about something trivial, unaware that a small war had just been won in one of those soundless rooms behind me. I knew the legal process would be long, but the exposure had happened. She could no longer hide behind it was just a drill. She had walked into her own trap. That night, I sat in my car outside the house where I'd grown up. The windows glowed faintly from inside. It used to feel like a cage. Now it just felt like a place that no longer belonged to her. I thought about the girl I'd been at 15, watching her control everything. And then I thought about the woman in the CID room watching her facade collapse piece by piece. This wasn't over, not yet. The case was moving to JAG. There would be courtrooms and lawyers and more testimony. But for the first time, it wasn't just my word against hers. It was evidence against her actions. It was CID against Vivian Blake. And I could breathe again. Do you believe someone can look at you through smoke and still smile? If you've seen that darkness too, comment, "Yes." The courtroom smelled faintly of polished wood and old air conditioning, the kind of dry cold that clings to your skin no matter how long you've been inside. This wasn't a military tribunal on base. It was a federal courtroom in downtown Fayetteville with JAG officers seated on one side and the civilian legal team on the other. Because the crime involved arson and attempted murder on federal property, both jurisdictions were entwined in this case. The flags behind the judge's bench hung perfectly still, their fabric crisp and untouched by the quiet tension that filled the room. I stood near the aisle in my dress uniform, hands folded in front of me, my nameplate catching the light from the overhead fixtures. The bailiff's voice carried over the room like a cold wind. "All rise." Vivian entered in a beige suit, not in cuffs yet, but the presence of two federal marshals flanking her spoke louder than shackles ever could. Her hair was neat, her expression controlled. She scanned the room looking for some corner to anchor herself in. Our eyes met briefly, and for the first time she didn't smile. There was no cold amusement, no smugness. Just a flicker of something sharp beneath her polished exterior. Fear, maybe. Or rage. The charges were read out first. Attempted murder. Arson. Obstruction on federal property. Each one carried its own weight, and hearing them aloud was like closing a book I had spent half my life trapped inside. The judge's voice was clear and steady. "Ms. Vivian Blake, how do you plead?" She lifted her chin. "Not guilty." Her lawyer, a tall man in a gray suit, stood beside her like a prop, reciting a carefully rehearsed line about misunderstandings and accidents. But accidents don't leave fingerprints on unauthorized locks. Accidents don't show up on camera locking someone in a burning building. The prosecution began laying out the timeline methodically. First came the base fire chief, a man with smoke-roughened hands who described the night in clear technical terms. The fire was intentional, he said. Accelerants were found near the stairwell. The building would have gone up faster if response time had been slower. Whoever said it knew how to use a drill to mask the initial ignition. His words fell like hammer strikes, each one hitting harder than the last. Then the CID agent Thomas took the stand. He wore a plain black suit instead of his usual field jacket, but his voice had the same measured weight it did during the interview. He described how they found the new lock, how Vivian had no authorization, how her fingerprints were lifted directly from the locking mechanism. "There is no ambiguity here," he said, pointing to the evidence photo projected on the screen behind him. The defendant was present at the scene, and she physically secured the victim in a room during a live fire. Vivian's lawyer objected once, claiming circumstantial interpretation, but the judge overruled him before the sentence even finished. Then they played the hallway footage. The lights dimmed slightly. On the big screen, Vivian appeared in grainy clarity. She approached the door key in hand, turned it, and walked away. The camera's timestamp flashed at the bottom corner. 19:07. I could hear people in the courtroom shift in their seats as they watched. There was something unnervingly calm about her movements. She wasn't panicked. She wasn't confused. She was deliberate. Then came the 911 call. The speakers crackled, and suddenly the room was filled with the sound of my voice from that night. Coughing, gasping, telling the dispatcher that I was locked inside the command office. "Smoke is coming in. I can't get the door open." Someone locked it. My own panic echoed off the walls of that courtroom sharper than I remembered it. For a moment, I felt like I was back there kneeling on the floor, breathing through my sleeve. But this time, instead of silence, there was the sound of dozens of people listening. MPs, CID, firefighters, attorneys, the judge, the jury, everyone. You could feel the way the air shifted when the last second of that call ended. The silence that followed was the kind that doesn't need to be explained. Vivian's lawyer tried to counter by painting the fire as an accident. He said she had panicked. He said she didn't realize I was inside. He said she thought it was just a drill. But the audio file of her voice came next. "When the fire drill comes, we'll see how tough you are." Hearing her own words fill the room stripped away any veneer of confusion she'd tried to build. The prosecutor leaned against the table and let the line echo. "Ladies and gentlemen, this was not panic. This was premeditation." I was called to the stand after that. My palms were slightly damp as I raised my right hand and swore to tell the truth. I'd rehearsed this moment in my head 100 times, but when I sat down, it wasn't rehearsed at all. It was just honest. I told them about the spare key that changed. The files moved. The night she told me the Army wouldn't protect me from family. The voice message. The way she smiled through the glass. I didn't cry. My voice didn't break. I spoke like a soldier giving a report because I was. The prosecutor asked me what I saw when I looked at her that night. "I saw someone who thought she would get away with it," I said. "Someone who thought no one would believe me." Then he asked what I felt when I heard her voice in the hallway footage. I took a slow breath. Relief. Because now everyone could see what I've lived with. The defense tried to rattle me, asked why I didn't confront her sooner, why I didn't report the signs earlier, why I didn't see it coming. I met the lawyer's eyes and said, "Because people like her build cages slowly, and when you grow up inside one, it takes time to realize the door is locked." When I stepped down, the judge called for a recess. I sat outside the courtroom in the hallway, staring at the seal of the court engraved into the floor. It looked solid, permanent, unshakable. For the first time in years, I felt the same way. After the recess, more witnesses took the stand. The MP who helped break the door described the lock. The firefighter detailed the smoke conditions and said if they'd arrived just a few minutes later, the outcome could have been catastrophic. Even one of my colleagues from the command office testified about Vivian's unauthorized presence near the building in the weeks prior. Each piece of testimony added another layer of weight to the case against her. Vivian sat at the defense table, her posture stiffening more with each witness. Her fingers gripped the edge of her chair. Gone was the woman who thought she was untouchable. All that remained was someone trapped under the evidence she thought no one would collect. When closing arguments came, the prosecutor stood straight and didn't waste time on theatrics. She walked into that building, she locked that door, she walked away, and she let a soldier suffocate in the dark. That's not an accident, that's a choice. The jury deliberated for 3 hours. Those were the longest 3 hours of my life. I sat in the quiet hallway outside with my hands folded in my lap, staring at the door they'd eventually walk back through. When they finally returned, their faces were tight with the weight of what they'd decided. "Guilty," the foreperson said. "On all counts." The judge delivered the sentence a week later. Years in federal prison. No possibility of parole for the first decade. Additional charges tied to obstruction on federal property added more time. I stood in the back of the courtroom during sentencing, my uniform collar crisp, my boots polished like mirrors. When they let her out, she turned to look at me one last time. There was no apology in her eyes, just the realization that the world no longer bent around her. When I walked out of the courthouse into the sunlight, the heat hit me like a wall. But it wasn't suffocating anymore. It was real, clean. The reporters standing outside shouted questions, but I didn't answer. I just kept walking, my head high, the weight of years lifting from my shoulders with each step. Justice isn't always loud. Sometimes it's a quiet door closing behind someone who thought they'd never hear it slam. 6 months after the verdict, winter settled over Fayetteville, like a heavy quilt, quiet and cold. The base looked different in the colder months, the sharp green of summer fading into muted grays and browns. I'd moved into a small house near the lake, far enough from the base to let the air feel like my own, but close enough that the sound of distant reveille still reached my porch on clear mornings. The rhythm of my life had changed since the trial. I slept through the night without waking to phantom alarms. I ran along the lake trail every dawn. I learned to breathe without checking over my shoulder. That morning, the letter arrived without fanfare. Just a plain white envelope with a federal stamp, my name, handwritten on the front in careful slanted script I recognized instantly. Vivian Blake. I stood in my kitchen with the envelope between my fingers, the kettle whistling softly on the stove. My pulse didn't spike. My hands didn't shake. I just stared at it. I opened it with the same precision I used to open after action reports, slicing the edge clean with a knife. The paper inside smelled faintly of the institutional detergent they use in prison laundry, sterile and sharp. Her handwriting hadn't changed. Every letter curled at the edges, deliberate and soft, like she was always telling a story meant to sound gentle. "Riley," it began. "You're all I have left. I know I made mistakes. I know I hurt you. But prison is not a place built for people like me. I can't survive here alone. Please, forgive me. I'm your stepmother. We're family. Don't let this be the end of us." I read it once, then again. The words were so polished, so perfectly chosen, that if I hadn't lived through everything she'd done, I might have thought she was sincere. She always knew how to twist language like wire soft on the outside, cutting underneath. She didn't say sorry for locking me inside a burning building. She didn't say sorry for the years she'd spent controlling my father, or for every moment she'd made me doubt my own instincts. She said prison wasn't for people like her. She said family like it was still supposed to mean something. I set the letter down and poured my tea. Steam curled upward as the winter light streamed through the window. A part of me, the part that used to flinch at the sound of her heels on the stairs, almost laughed. She was still playing the same game, except now the board wasn't hers anymore. The call came 2 days later. Unknown number. I almost let it go to voicemail, but something told me to pick up. Staff Sergeant Morgan, a smooth male voice, asked, "This is Michael Harlan. I'm representing Ms. Vivian Blake in her appeal hearing." I didn't answer immediately. "She's asked that we reach out to you. As her stepdaughter and the victim in the case, your statement carries considerable weight." If you were willing to provide testimony about the possibility of rehabilitation or family reconciliation, the board may consider a sentence reduction. I let the silence stretch so long that he finally cleared his throat. Ms. Blake has expressed deep remorse. She believes she can, I cut him off. She believes she can use me. Excuse me, she believes she can use me. I repeated calm and flat. That's what she's always done. You don't have to read me her script. I already know how it ends. He hesitated, probably not used to victims who sound like they're giving a briefing. Ms. Morgan, I understand this is difficult, but family considerations can. I almost laughed then. Family! My voice didn't rise, but the steel in it made him stop talking. She locked me inside a burning building. She turned a fire drill into a death trap. She smiled at me through the glass. And now she wants me to help her. She has no one else, he said softly, as if that might move me. I stared out the window at the thin layer of frost glinting on the porch railing. That's not my problem. The line was quiet for a moment before he asked, Would you like to provide a formal response we can give to the board? Yes, I said. My voice was steady. Tell them I survived the night she locked me in. I don't owe her anything. Then I ended the call. For a long time, I just stood there, the phone still warm in my hand. The silence in my house was deep, the kind that doesn't echo with old fear anymore. I realized in that moment that something inside me had shifted permanently. 6 months earlier, a letter like that might have torn at some buried thread in me. It might have made me doubt myself, but now it just proved something I'd learned the hard way. People like Vivian don't ask for forgiveness because they've changed. They ask because they've lost control. A week later, another envelope came from the legal office, a copy of her formal petition for sentence reduction. She cited family connection, emotional duress, capacity for rehabilitation. I didn't even open it fully. I scanned the first paragraph, then dropped it into the small metal lockbox under my desk. Not because it mattered, because I wanted to keep a record of every time she tried to pull me back into her web. I thought about visiting her once, not because I wanted to see her, but because part of me wanted to stand on the other side of the glass and let her look at me the way I'd looked at her through that command office door. I wanted her to see the distance between us made real. But then I realized that would give her something she wanted a stage. So I didn't go. I spent the following weeks focusing on the life she no longer had power over. My father's old house had been sold to pay for his medical care before he passed, and I'd stopped visiting the neighborhood entirely. My days belonged to me now. I trained, I worked, I ran, I breathed. On weekends, I volunteered at the local Veterans Support Center, talking to soldiers who carried their own invisible cages. I never mentioned her by name, but when they asked how you survive, people who try to crush you quietly, I told them, you document everything. You believe yourself even when no one else does. And when the moment comes, you walk out and leave them in the fire they built. In early February, my MP contact called to let me know her appeal had been denied. He didn't sound surprised. Neither was I. People like her don't win when there are fingerprints cameras and their own words damning them. Thought you'd want to know, he said. She doesn't get out early. Good, I said simply. That night, I walked down to the lake. The air was cold enough to bite my skin and the stars hung low and clear. I stood at the water's edge, hands in my jacket pockets, and let the silence settle into me. For years, her shadow had filled every corner of my life. Even when she wasn't speaking, she was there in the way I measured my steps, in the way I double-checked locks, in the way I learned to breathe small in my own home. But now the space was empty. Her voice was just ink on paper and echoes in a courtroom. I didn't write her back. I didn't call the lawyer again. I didn't respond to the petition, because not responding was the loudest answer I could give. People talk a lot about forgiveness like it's some kind of moral requirement, like healing can't exist without it. But forgiveness isn't the same thing as release. I didn't need to forgive her to reclaim my life. I just needed to stop letting her hold a place in it. She'd built her power on my silence. Now my silence belonged to me. I went back inside, locked the door behind me, and sat down at the kitchen table. The letter she'd sent was still there, folded neatly where I'd left it. I picked it up once more, not to read it, but to remind myself what it represented. Then I slid it into the drawer and closed it softly. It wasn't burning with anger anymore. It wasn't trembling with fear. It was quiet. Final. She'd tried to build a fire around me, but I'd walked through it. And now, standing in the calm that followed, I understood what real power felt like, not revenge, not rage, just the unshakable weight of a life that no longer belonged to her. Morning came soft and gold, the kind of morning Fayetteville only gives you in late winter when the sun cuts through the cold without burning it away. My new house sat a few miles from the lake, tucked behind a line of pine trees. It wasn't big or expensive, but it was quiet. And after everything, quiet was what I wanted. Not the quiet that used to press against my lungs, the kind that comes from fear, but the kind that feels earned. A clean silence. A silence that belonged to me. I woke early as I always did. Habit. The Army has a way of shaping your hours even when the world around you changes. I brewed a cup of coffee and watched the mist lift off the lake from my kitchen window. The air still held that crisp bite that comes before spring takes over, and the sound of geese echoed across the water. The house didn't creak under someone else's steps. No voice waited for me at the door. No shadow lurked on the porch. Just me. Just now. I slipped on a hoodie, laced up my running shoes, and took the trail that curved along the lake shore. Running had become something different since the trial. It wasn't an escape anymore. It was proof of breath. Proof that I was here, still moving, still choosing every step for myself. My feet pounded the earth in a steady rhythm, the cold air burning in my lungs in a way that made me feel alive. I passed other early risers, 2 retirees with a golden retriever, a young couple jogging in matching jackets, but their faces blurred into the scenery. This was my space now. 6 months had passed since Vivian's letter and her failed appeal. Her name still showed up in official updates from time to time. It was clinical now, a number, a line in a legal document, a ghost in a system she could no longer manipulate. I didn't flinch when I saw it. It didn't own me anymore. I'd started volunteering at the family advocacy program on base. Every Wednesday night, I sat in a modest room with other service members, men and women who'd lived their own versions of control, fear, and silence, and we talked. Not about pity, not about weakness, but about building new spaces for ourselves. Some of them still had fresh bruises on their hearts. Some were years removed from what happened to them. But every time one of them said I thought no one would believe me, I heard echoes of my own voice. And every time I told them I know I meant it. The program didn't turn me into a savior. It didn't erase the past. But it gave me something solid to stand on, something that belonged entirely to the person I became after the fire, after the courtroom, after the silence cracked open. Every few weeks, I drove past the command office on base. I didn't plan it that way. Sometimes it was just the fastest route. But every time I turned that corner and saw the building, my hands used to tighten on the steering wheel. The memory of that night, the sound of the door locking, the smoke curling under the frame, Vivian's calm face in the hallway, used to sit like a weight on my chest. But this morning I slowed the car down. Not to stare, not to relive it, just to notice. The door had been replaced. The lock was new again. The walls had been repainted. Soldiers walked in and out without a second thought. Life had gone on inside that building long after that night ended, and I had too. I parked near the curb and got out. The air carried that sharp, earthy scent of cold pavement after a night frost. I walked up to the spot where I'd pounded my fists against the door, where I'd screamed her name through the glass. My breath formed small clouds in front of me. My pulse didn't spike. My palms didn't sweat. I just stood there and let the quiet fill the space she once tried to claim. I let myself remember not the fear, but the strength. I remembered pressing my sleeve over my mouth, counting my breaths, refusing to let panic win. I remembered the sound of boots running down the hall, the crowbar slamming against the door, the sudden rush of air when it opened. And most of all, I remembered walking out. She locked me in to silence me. CID opened that door, but I walked out on my own strength. That sentence had been sitting in the back of my mind for months, waiting for the right moment. And standing there in the winter sunlight, I finally understood what it meant. No one could take away the fact that I survived her. Not the smoke, not the manipulation, not the years of being treated like I was a complication in her perfect story. She built the fire, but I carried the match that burned down her power. I pulled out my phone and recorded a short video, not for her, not for the trial, not even for the system. For me. For anyone who's ever been locked in their own kind of room. The camera caught the morning light behind me. I didn't script it. I didn't need to. She locked me in to silence me, I said softly, looking straight at the lens. CID opened that door, but I walked out on my own strength. I let the silence after that line hang there, heavy and clean. I ended the recording, but I didn't walk away immediately. I leaned against the railing, hands in my pockets, and breathed. For years, silence meant danger. Now it meant peace. When I got home, I uploaded the video with a simple caption: "If you believe truth always finds its way out, share this. You are not alone." I didn't expect anything from it. But deep down, I knew someone somewhere needed to hear those words the way I once needed to hear them myself. By the time evening came, the comments were already filling in. Strangers, soldiers, retirees, people who had their own Vivian, their own locked doors, their own moments of clawing their way back into the world. I didn't need to reply to all of them. Just reading them was enough. It was a chorus I never thought I'd be part of, but here I was, alive and steady. The sun dipped low, setting the lake on fire with orange light. I sat on the porch steps, a blanket wrapped around my shoulders, listening to the water lap against the shore. For years, I thought strength meant never breaking. Now I knew it meant something quieter. It meant surviving the fire, walking through the smoke, and choosing peace over fear. Vivian Blake was just a name on paper now, a person locked behind walls she built for herself. But I was free. If you believe the truth always finds its way out, share this. You are not alone.